Good morning, and welcome to today's webcast, Critical Workforce Trends in 2023. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Brett Addis and Tammy Lohr. With that, I'll turn it over to Brett.
Thank you, everybody. Really excited to be here. We've got some really hot topics. A little background about myself. I am the practice director for our Human Capital Advisory group or team. Been in the industry for 25 years, both as in management consulting, but as well as an HR practitioner. Tammy, over to you.
Thanks, Brett, and thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Tammy Lohr, and I am a senior manager in our strategy and operations consulting group. I primarily work with clients that operate in the public sector, such as state and local governments, school districts, and higher education institutions, on being able to achieve their goals by looking at things like people, processes, and systems. And I'm very excited to be here today and talk about that people component, since it's becoming increasingly evident to organizations, really regardless of industry, that employees are absolutely key to achieving our organizational goals.
All right, thanks, Tammy. So I want to cover off really quickly just the agenda for the session, and then I'm going to provide some quick opening remarks, and I'm actually going to hand it over to Tammy. So first of all, again, welcome everyone. Tammy and I had an opportunity to introduce ourselves, so we aren't going to do that again, but thank you for joining. Second, as I mentioned, we're going to go through a quick session introduction where I'm just going to kick things off really short and simple, and then we're going to really dive into this and focus on some of the key 2023 workforce trends. Tammy and I are going to share some calls to action in terms of how you can look at mitigating some of the risks and challenges associated with these trends. And then we will close and wrap it up and let you go on with your day. So thank you, guys. Let me jump to the next slide. All right. So first of all, I just want to pause because I'm really excited about doing this webcast today. And there's three reasons. First, this is the first webcast that we've been able to do with the Human Capital Advisory practice. So that's number one, why I'm so excited. Second, I get to present with an amazing co-presenter, Tammy, who is just fantastic. And then third, as I mentioned earlier, we got some really awesome topics. But before we dive into the topics, I just want to touch on a couple things. So organizations are in a really precarious situation right now when it comes to the workforce. We've seen a lot of disruption over the last few years, and frankly, this year hasn't been any different. We've gone through COVID-19, we've shifted the way that we're working, we're looking at how we're working differently as organizations, and even as I mentioned, the past 2 months itself has given us some really great insight into what 2023 has in store as we think about areas such as returning to work, future of work, the digitization of HR. But even as you think about broader than that, we're also seeing a lot of compliance and regulation changes. A lot of our government clients and governments are starting to reduce some of the requirements of jobs. So there's a lot of changes going on right now, which is really fascinating, but also extremely scary when we start looking at what the future of work is going to look like. So as we go through this session, there is a Q&A area, so please feel free to add any questions that you might have or comments that you might have, and we're going to dive into this. So let me go through what we're going to cover today, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tammy. So there's a tons of workforce trends out there, first of all, and I would love to sit here and go through the laundry list of them, but to be honest with you, we don't have time. And I don't think you do either, unless you want to come back for another week or so and we can spend time doing that. But we really started looking at some of the key trends that were impacting organizations and our clients, not only North America, but around the world. And the first is around talent acquisition, right? How are we really thinking about acquiring talent? What are the impacts of acquiring talent? We know that talent is in demand. You know, what's going on there? The second is around engagement, collaboration, and inclusivity. We have never seen record high engagement, low engagement numbers if we have as of recent. This is a major issue within all organizations, especially with the reduction in force happening, these workforce changes happening. A lot of things are going around that. Retention of talent, not only from just people leaving, but also retiring, right? Do we have the right skill sets and the succession plans in place to replace the talent that we're losing? And then what's happening with all that work when they do leave, right? It's falling back, which is causing some of the other issues. Another key area that has been coming out recently is around manager and leadership development. This is we often think about our workforce in itself, but we don't always think about our executives and our leaders in terms of how prepared are they to move into this next generation of work. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Of course, we're going to dive into one of my favorite topics, which is digitization of HR, which is really starting to think about what is the role of HR moving forward? How do they operate? How do we leverage technology and some of the cool innovation that we're seeing in the market to really help you perform your jobs better and faster, but also drive a lot more value to the business? And then lastly, future of work, right? Which we are all hearing about this every day. If you're on LinkedIn or Twitter, it's constant future work, future work, future work stuff. So we're going to unpack all of these items for you today. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer them all during the Q&A. With that said, Tammy, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Brett. We're going to start out with our first polling question. So we want to hear from all of you and see which of those workforce challenges that Brett just talked about are the most pressing for our audience members today. And I know that the clients that I've been working with, again, I work primarily with the public sector, that talent acquisition and retention have been particularly challenging as those organizations are struggling to compete with private industry, especially when it comes to compensation and flexible work environment options. And with inflation being so high, the cost of living just increasing and increasing, a lot of employees were leaving those public sector positions for higher paying roles in other industries, especially if they were in IT and finance. Those have been the functions that were really hit hard over the last couple of years. Brett, what are you seeing with your clients?
You know, I would love to sell you a talent acquisition retention, but it's really everything, right? It's how are we paying our people effectively? How are we thinking about equity? What's going on with diversity and inclusion? You know, this is one of those areas we say I love to unpack it in these four little areas, but there's so much going on right now. But I will tell you, really, when I think of probably the top issue right now is talent acquisition. You know, how do we really acquire, source, find, attract? What's our employer value proposition in terms of getting the right talent, the right skills that we need?
Absolutely. I think that's been around for a couple of years and it may not be going away just yet. And I think you bring up a great point that DEI is really front and center for a lot of organizations and for a lot of job candidates and employees to really understand how employers are operationalizing that value proposition. So let's see what everyone said. All right, so we were pretty spot on. We had about half of the audience members today thinking that talent acquisition was really pressing, and then talent retention was trailing at 25% with engagement at 12.6%. So we are spot on with what the audience is experiencing versus what we're seeing in our clients.
That's right.
So we hope
Well, it's good to know we're meeting them where they're at, Tammy. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. There's another buzzword.
Okay,
for
great.
today.
So let's get into talking about our first trend, talent acquisition. 44% of you think that this is really a really crucial area for your organization. And again, that is not surprising to us. It's certainly been a recurring theme for the past couple of years as we've seen a lot of growth in headcount. This phenomena has occurred across a wide variety of sectors simultaneously and has resulted in significant competition for attracting and hiring talent. Now, some organizations are preparing for an economic downturn, really depending on what sector you're in, market conditions within that sector. And when that happens, there can be this gut reaction to freeze hiring. So then why are we talking about talent acquisition? Well, it's still really critical for most of the folks that are on this webcast today, and certainly something that we're seeing with our clients. So what we're showing you here on this slide are some best practices to use in thinking about your talent acquisition practices. And I just want to note that in general, hiring freezes across the board tend to not be very effective for organizations and will often result in delayed performance after the economy bounces back. But again, it sounds like most of the folks that are on the call today are not experiencing that. So I'll go through this. What we want to propose here is to first be thinking about your organizational strategy. What are the goals that your organization is trying to achieve? Are you going deeper into a particular market? Are you expanding into a new market? For my clients in the public sector, this could be trying to expand public outreach or strategic choices about what curriculum or courses to offer at a school, or reasonably what enrollment trends are saying, what are our demographics looking like for the individuals that we're serving, and what implications does that have for what we need to be focusing on as an organization. After that, we can move forward in evaluating our workforce strategy, which includes taking stock of what you have and what you need in terms of talent, skills, experience, and resource capacity to achieve your organizational goals. And when you're armed with that information, you can start to be pretty strategic in your talent acquisition targets in support of your organizational goals. It is important to prioritize which positions we're recruiting for and what are the key competencies that those employees absolutely need to have. A lot of times we find that people are really difficult to replace, not only because they have a lot of institutional knowledge, but also because they managed a really broad portfolio of projects or functions. And it can be really hard to find someone with that same type of experience and be able to pick up right where they left off. So this is also an opportunity to rethink the roles that your organization is hiring for during this workforce strategy analysis. Thinking about things like, is this position replicable? What else would we like someone in this position to be able to do? What is their growth path for this position, this role? And are we reasonably going to be able to find someone with the appropriate experience for the job description that we have put out there? One of the other major shifts that we've seen in talent acquisition over the past several years is greater emphasis on finding a good mutual fit between job candidates and employers. Candidates are not necessarily just looking at compensation, but they're thinking about things like your brand. What do you stand for? What are your organizational values? They're also looking at your culture. How and to what extent are you operationalizing your reported values? Do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion program? We'll get into that next. But also, do you have information on ESG reporting? What do people on Glassdoor say about working there? The job candidates that we're seeing today want to feel really proud of where they work. And they're certainly doing that research on the employer's value proposition since they have so many options that are available to them. And that means you, as hiring organizations, have to do a really good job of writing your job postings to highlight your values and expectations for your employees. Then we have to be sure that there's good hiring processes that adequately reflect those values and provide the opportunity for candidates and hiring managers to evaluate that potential mutual fit. There are a number of other strategies to think about to help you secure the best possible talent, like where and how are you posting positions? Are you using a headhunter? Do we have referral bonuses or programs in place so that our existing employees can refer other folks that are a good fit for this organization? Thinking about different types of incentives that might be able to help you fill those critical talent gaps. Once you can actually attract and hire the right talent for your organization, you'll continue to monitor and evaluate your workforce and your organizational results, which I know Brett is very passionate about and will be talking about a little bit later in today's presentation. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about employee engagement, collaboration, and inclusivity. Like I said on the last slide, job candidates are really doing their homework on potential employers because they want to work somewhere that they can be really proud of and have a meaningful contribution. These elements not only relate to attracting talent, but also to retention and leadership development. As Brett has already mentioned, the bad news is that research shows employee engagement is at its lowest point in almost a decade. When we put that in combination with a very strong labor market, that means that organizations are being less productive and they're at risk of losing key employees. And part of that could certainly be attributed to the pandemic and employees transitioning to work from home, which then resulted in increased workloads, not just within work, but also due to other obligations like children participating in remote learning and being a caregiver and all the things that the pandemic really brought up. All of these demands often meant that people had less time to spend with their teams in order to stay connected. And the bottom line is that when your employees aren't engaged, then their performance is impacted, and your performance as an organization is impacted, whether that's reflected in less than ideal customer interactions, long customer wait times, reduced sales, project delays, whatever that particular situation might be for your organization. So what this slide is showing you is just at a glance what engagement looks like and how employees show up for work based on their engagement level. And you'll notice within the text on the slide that there is a very strong correlation between these three values of engagement, collaboration, and inclusivity. So when you have more engagement, you have more collaboration, and you have more inclusivity. So at the lower left-hand corner, you can see that disengaged employees at best are absent. They may complete their work, but they don't really participate in meetings. They don't necessarily support organizational improvements, and they're not really coalescing around a team. As you work your way up that engagement scale, there's greater clarity between an individual's role, how it contributes to the organization, how it advances their own career, and how they can help participate and build teams for shared success. Those highly engaged employees are seen as leaders and are much better equipped to foster those strong, inclusive relationships across your organization. There's some bad news here, but there's also some good news that organizations are increasingly understanding the importance of these values as being really invested in their employees. So I almost wish that right now we had another polling question, Brett, where it was like, how many organizations have a DEI program? Or really even how long has that DEI program been around? A lot of organizations might have had a DEI program back in 2019, but it was probably managed by HR over there in the corner, had some executive sponsorship, but now that is front and center for many organizations. And we're seeing a lot more attention brought to that, a lot more intention in terms of developing a program, making the program actionable, monitoring our results and goals towards that program to create an engaged, inclusive workforce. So there's a lot more emphasis on valuing employees as individuals that can each bring their unique perspective and work together as a benefit to the entire team and the entire organization. And that is absolutely critical to help with your employee engagement. And I'll move on to our next trend, which is retention of talent. And boy, have we seen some wild trends in employee attrition over the last couple of years. I think last year I couldn't go a full week without a client telling me that a key employee in their organization had left or was about to leave. And that circles back to that low employee engagement and the importance of employee satisfaction and talent retention. For organizations to be able to sustain or grow their existing levels of service, they are going to need to invest in their talent in a very tangible way. This ends up tying back to your culture, your value proposition, and your ability to achieve your goals. If your people are not working together, working effectively, and working on a stable team, then you are left with highly disruptive operational processes, reduced productivity as a result of that, and ultimately elevated workloads, which then creates that cycle for employees, can create some unclear direction, and a lot of other things that can really harm your organization's progress. So what this slide is really depicting is all the benefits of retaining your high-performing employees. You can experience increased productivity, reduce costs from the need to recruit and train new employees on an ongoing basis, stronger relationships across the organization that support teamwork, employee engagement, that sense of inclusion, and ultimately a better employee experience. When all of these elements are in place, your organization is in a much better position to be able to operate smoothly. What this slide is not showing is that not all employees necessarily should be retained. If you have a bad actor on the team, that erodes employee engagement, the sense of team, the sense of inclusion, and ultimately productivity. So I do want to point out that it's important for management to be able to address performance issues and show everyone else on the team that the high priority is the team rather than the individual employee. With that, I'll turn it over to Brett to go over our next polling question.
Awesome. Thank you, Tammy, and an amazing job. And I want to actually say two things on this because as I was listening to your presentation, for those of you who are part of HR organizations on the call, one of the big trends right now is the huge attrition rate and retention issues with HR itself. And a lot of organizations are seeing major burnout within their HR staff. In fact, I talked to a client the other day. He went from 6 to 2, right? And the question is, do we have to replace them? Do we have to go hire new ones, or can we think of how we do work differently? Which is what we will be talking about here in just a couple minutes. So, thank you again, Tammy, for the amazing job. So, before I ask the question, I actually want to provide a bit of a statistic because I think it's interesting. And Tammy covered a little bit about this, but according to one of the latest Gallup reports, they outlined that 51% of employees are disengaged, while 13% are actively disengaged. Now, what's interesting about this is one thing, as Tammy mentioned, about being disengaged and not wanting to do your work, but it's the actively disengaged individuals who we have to worry about. They are the ones who are out there spreading the misery and the negativity across to its colleagues and the rest of the workforce, right? So going back to Tammy's point, when you think about the retention issues, sometimes retention isn't always bad, right? And so if you want to continue to grow and evolve as an organization, sometimes you need to get rid of the bad apples. So, but it looks like we're getting some submittals. So the question was that I never got to, Tammy, which was what percent of your organization employees are disengaged? And we've got a handful of responses. So what are you seeing, Tammy? That's the bigger question.
Yeah, I think it varies a lot by organization. And what's difficult here is that the role of leadership and management comes into play here. And so there can be really difficult times that are faced by school districts, for example. School districts had a very difficult time over the last several years with transitioning with remote learning, and now we're back, and now maybe we're hybrid, and there's been so many changes for employees to be able to keep up with, and that's part of that industry. However, I have worked with school districts that have really poor engagement, but I've also worked with districts that have really high engagement, and they're really centered all around the same value of thinking about the student, How do we help the student? How do we equip our teachers to be able to help the student and give them the tools and the materials in order to do their jobs effectively? So that's just one example that comes to mind, that it's so highly variable, really based on leadership and management and that communication of what's happening, why it's happening, and how we're going to be able to prepare you as an employee for the next iteration of our organization.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's see what the participants say. So 48, almost 50% said 16 to 30% of their workforce. So if you calculate that in dollars, only 70% of the workforce is truly performing. So the organization is losing productivity, losing dollar sales, losing what, almost 30% of the currently. So, I mean, that's pretty staggering. I mean, I think what's interesting about this is that it does align with a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of what the industry's saying. And then I also think if you add this to the next one, which is the other 15%, I mean, that's a huge chunk of people. We should have asked to follow which ones are actively disengaged, but we won't go to that level of depth. So, all right. Well, let's dive into to the next topic, which is manager and leadership development. So one of the things here is that as we prepare for these sessions, we often go and do a lot of research, as you can imagine. And some of the research, frankly, just is staggering. And the question is, do we actually want to share this? Because sometimes it's not always positive. But regardless, we want to share the truth. So that it is what it is. But, one of the things that when we were starting to dig in, or when I was starting to dig on some of the manager leadership development piece, it was really around the CEO's level of confidence in their own leadership skills to be able to take the organization to the next level. And it's really scary when you start looking at the low level of confidence. And basically when they look at that, they're looking at, do I have the right talent in place today? Does that talent have the right skill sets to move with the organization or take the organization to the next level, whether that's moving from a more of a stagnant to a digital-based type of structure? Is it about adding new business models, new services, new products, things like that? And right now the CEO isn't confident. The other key piece about this is that when we look at not having those right skills capabilities, not only are we looking at financial and performance impacts, but we're also looking at issues around employee trust, development, progression, and attrition, right? And so part of the issue here and why managers and leadership needs to develop, one part is, yes, to move the organization forward, but the second part is to actually be good leaders and be good people managers. And if your people don't trust you in terms of your management capabilities, then they're not going to work as hard for you. And some of the interesting thing about what we saw here was that, when we looked at some of the statistics here, when we look at some of the management issues regarding to its people, it was a lot of employees didn't even feel that the confidence of their manager to help them progress. A lot of managers weren't working with their employees on what are the development plans to get to the next role. A lot of managers and leaders didn't have the empathetic or human-centric type of skills to actually deal with employees, right? And so this is a really critical aspect. So what do we mean by human leadership? And I think this is really critical. And this is where I come back to is being able to really understand your team or your workforce, understanding the needs that they have. And again, these needs shift, right? We were in 5 different stages of the workforce. I know that's been changing a little bit in terms of, the percent of retiring individuals, the percent of new employees coming in out of school, et cetera. But I think it's understanding your workforce and really understanding what their aspirations are and being able to guide them and lead them as authentic and empathetic as possible, but be also to be adaptive in terms of the changing of that type of workforce, but also the changing of the business. The second area is really around being an employee-centric leader, right? An employee-centric really looks at this saying, what am I doing to actually engage my employees, build autonomy among the staff, help drive collaboration, and really give our employees a secure sense of identity. And this isn't just about getting people together and having a team building exercise. This is really about learning who your people are. It's about really understanding, again, some of the needs from the human leadership perspective, but also allowing the employees to be creative, allowing them to fail, allowing them to perform agile type based work really allows them to interdevelop. And the last one is really around talent planning. And talent planning really gets down to understanding its own staffing needs, right? And part of this is around acquiring, right? And part of this is around looking at the business and saying, okay, what are the skills I need now? What are the skills I'm going to need in 12 months? Or what are the skills I'm going to need in the next 24 to 36 months? And it's about also them looking inward and saying, do I have those skills today? Do I have individuals that I can develop and train? Do I have successors in place that can take over some of my management and leadership responsibilities? And I think this has been a key issue, is that the managers themselves really haven't had clean insight and data on what their workforce looks like. And we're seeing a lot of this today as the workforce is shifting, and we're looking to move to a lot of these much more shadowing type of work, where we're instead of acquiring individuals, we're trying to leverage our own talent to go perform new functions or to help staff aug doing other things when people are leaving. And if we could understand what skills and capabilities that we had, and I know we can also say, hey, they're baked into our HRIS system, but you know as well as I do, they always aren't. You know what? Giving that clear visibility and understanding would help them manage their people much better. And then I think that the last piece I'll just mention here before I go on to the next slide is really around the soft-based development. You know, and this kind of encompasses all of these things, but you know, this is again building relationships. You know, it's building relationships between the employee and the manager, to really both sides understand what the goals and direction are, so that everyone can be headed towards a common purpose. So I'm going to jump to the next slide, which is going to be focused on digitization of HR. Now, this again is one of my favorite topics, and Tammy is smiling because I throw fun buzzwords all the time around AI and machine learning and all of these other things. But anyways, so what is digitization of HR really? In reality, what it means is that HR needs to work differently in the future. Now, I can throw all those buzzwords in and say, well, hey, based on technology, we need to work differently. But the reality is it's not based on technology. You know, technology is an influencer and an enabler of how we work. Right? It can influence us in terms of some of its capabilities. And we look at those capabilities and say, well, could we use automation? Could we use AI? Could we use, you know, robotics? Could we use all of these cool, fun buzzwords, you know, to help us do our job better? In some cases, the answer is yes. Some cases, the answer is no. But this is really also more about better aligning and driving business value. And so when I go in and I talk to a CEO or a CFO or even a CHRO, and we talk about common challenges with HR, you know, of course, we get some system issues, we get some process things, but most of the time it's around alignment of HR to the business and having a clear understanding of what the HR value is to the business. And so as we think about this digitization concept and really thinking differently around HR works, it's really looking at this concept, which I'm going to break down into two areas. On the model, if you go to the far left, this is really around those high automation potentials. So going back to what's the value to the business, how can we reduce costs? How can we create efficiency? How can we create better employee experience, right? How can we do things with less people in some instances? But also how can we leverage people differently? And this is where we look at things around, those high potential automation activities, those payroll benefits, a lot of the data and support functions. And if you look at the model here, you'll also see a lot of the buzzwords I talked about around machine learning and AI. And of course, I'm going to throw out the most highly buzzword used of all time, which is the chat GBT, right? And how are we using and incorporating that? If you are on LinkedIn, there's tons of stuff out there right now, so I'm not going to go into that detail. But this is really around how do we look at HR and being able to drive efficiency and effectiveness to the business. Now, before I go on to the other piece of this, what's also really interesting is, and I've been doing, I have the same model that I've been using, I think, Tammy, for 15 years that has 3 triangles, and it's, well, 2 triangles, I added a third. It said transactional HR and strategic HR, right? And I always draw this little arrow in the middle that goes around and around and around, and I think it's like a hurricane. And it's because HR is trying to move to the lighter green, but something keeps pulling them back to the transaction. And I'm not going to unpack that right now, but this is really the challenge that we're facing as organizations are trying to move from a more digital, automated way to a much more strategic way, which just gets us into the far right, which is those low automated opportunities that drive better business alignment interaction. And when we look at this, there's really 3 components, right? And I'm going to start on the right and work my way back. The first is around manage. And so manage is really around your HR leadership. And I'm going to use this old adage because I read it the other day and I haven't read it in years, is does HR have a true seat at the business table? Are they viewed as a people advisor, right? Are they aligned to the businesses in regards to providing the right services and capabilities it needs to drive the business forward? That could be a yes or no question. The second is the expert. And so the expert is typically what we're viewed as the HR business partner, but also it could be viewed as some of those key functional areas like head of total rewards, head of talent management, head of benefits, head of, whatever else, you come up with another one. But anyways, these are the experts in the organization who are steering the HR strategy to align with the business. The third area is really important, which is the interaction level, right? And these are the people who are actually engaging with the business. So in some instances, could be this is where the HR business partner might kind of cross over a little bit, but this is also around HR service delivery. It's what's the experience that we're bringing to our employees and our managers, and how are we making their lives easier versus complicating it to ensure that they're able to do the jobs that they need to do. So a lot of really great stuff here, but what this comes down to is we need to find a way to reduce some of the muck, I will call it, to allow HR and the workforce to start transition much more effectively, or all of the issues that we're talking about, frankly, are going to be bogged down in all of the transactional work, and we aren't going to be able to drive a lot of these strategic initiatives and solve these problems. So the last area I wanted to touch on was future of work. And I would bet if I asked the question, how many of you are experiencing challenges with how you're defining future of work? I think everyone would say I am, and if you're not, I'm not going to question you. I'm just kidding. But anyways, but the reality is that, right now, this not only is a very hot topic, but it's a very undefined topic. And as I was doing some research on this, I mean, you could come up with 20 definitions right after each other, and every one of them is close, but every one of them is a little bit different. But the reality of it is that future of work is really around reimagining a workforce of radical flexibility for desk and deskless workers, right? And basically what that means is that we need to start thinking differently around how we allow and enable our people to work. And the reason I use desk and deskless is because not everyone sits in an office, right? And we have to really have the opportunity to look at our entire workforce and say, what are those critical roles that need to be here? What are the critical roles that would be nice to have here? And what are the roles that, well, honestly, it doesn't really matter. Now, the other interesting fact about this is wherever they work, there are no statistics that show that organizations' productivity went down, that they lost money. There's none of that. So this brings up another trend, which is future of work really being driven by desire or reality? right? Does a leader want his people in the office because he wants them there, or is it based on performance? And again, as I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of statistics to say that performance went down. Now, let's dive into some of these, and then I'm going to go to a poll, and then we'll go through some call to actions really quickly. So I think the three areas that we typically look at as it comes to future work is, one is when and where is the work done, right? And so this is really looking at, again, flexible schedules, the hybrid, the return to work, remote, all of those things. The second is who does the work. And, you know, and a lot of this comes back to the slide I mentioned before around digitizing HR, but this is also digitizing finance, digitizing supply chain, digitizing, you know, everybody. This is really around how we work different, but also looking at the workforce different. You know, do we use crowdsourcing? Do we outsource? Do we use contractors? So there's a lot of strategies that go into thinking differently around the future of work. And then lastly is around how work is done. And again, I'm not going to go through all these. I listed them off in a minute, but this is really around looking at technology as an influencer enabler in terms of how our workforce can actually drive and do its work most effectively. So with that said, let's go into another poll. So what strategies in your organization is your organization employing to overcome some of the workforce challenges that Tammy and I just outlined? Tammy, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so again, I'm primarily in the public sector. There's been an awareness over the last sort of 5 to 7 years of the silver tsunami, and during COVID, it arrived. There was a huge wave of retirements, especially people being like, I don't want to figure out how to redo my job a million different times in a million different ways, because now we're doing everything remotely and I can't go talk to Susie Q down the hall and get her sign off on this thing. And so I've seen a lot of emphasis on workforce development to be able to sort of fill the gaps that were left by really key individuals at organizations. I think over the pandemic, we've also seen a lot more emphasis on HR automation, because HR as an internal service was often sort of left behind in a lot of innovation. And so we realized that we needed to be able to do our work. And we didn't necessarily have the processes set up in 2020 to be able to do that. And so we've seen a lot more emphasis on that as well. I had one client where they had someone that had to physically go into the office with full PPE on in the very early stages of the pandemic in order to just pay invoices. And they were the only person that would be allowed in the office, but there was no way to otherwise get that work done. And so that's not an HR example, but there were other examples of for HR. But I think that those two are sort of what I've seen the most. And of course, DEI, but again, public sector organizations were sort of doing that pre-pandemic, and now it's really just front and center.
And to DEI, there were some articles that came out earlier this year about cost cutting, and DEI was unfortunately one of those areas which completely remains to baffle me to this day. But I agree, absolutely. Workforce development has been really, really high. So let's see what the participants had to say. I feel like I want to say survey says, ding, or something. I don't know. We got to come up with something a little fancier. All right. 28.9%. Oh, we are on it today.
I know. Yeah.
I'm going to give you a Starbucks gift card for being so accurate today. But
Please do.
This is awesome. I will. So 28.9% workforce development. Even you guys can read, but I'm going to go through this. And then targeted recruiting, right? Which is, we talked about that and the importance. And it's funny about HR automation, just really, really quickly, because again, this is one of those. I view as 2018 and 2019, it was a must-have. And then when COVID hit, it was a muster-have. And then, I'm just kidding, it was a more, right? You know what I'm saying? And then as we started to kind of shift, it's gone back to more aspirational. And I don't understand that. And that's something that we'll have to dive into on another day. But thank you guys thank you all for taking that poll. All right. So I'm going to hand it back over to Tammy to talk about how to solve some of these workforce challenges.
Great. Yeah, so now that we've talked about some of these workforce trends for 2023, we're going to talk a little bit more about the strategies that organizations are using to actually overcome these challenges. And you know, we don't want to have this entire webcast be all gloom and doom around the state of human capital without shedding some light on ways to really navigate the current environment. These challenges are not likely to disappear overnight. Many of them have persisted over the last several years, but over time, the tools that we're going to talk about today will be able to help organizations evolve their processes and become or remain an employer of choice. So the first recommendation that we wanted to talk about is strategic planning. So in the last polling question, we had a lot of very tangible initiatives that you could pursue to address one or many of the workforce challenges that we've talked about today. But it's really important that all of these programs fit together, work together, and are planned to be able to support one another. So to start the strategic planning process, again, we're going to start by evaluating where are we at right now, where do we have gaps in order to achieve our organizational goals and our strategic objectives. We've talked about this in almost every single workforce challenge, right? That we have to start by stopping and taking stock of where we're at and where we want to be and what the gaps are in order to get us there. Then we have to be able to think about those gaps strategically. Which ones go together? Which ones could be standalone items? Are there dependencies among our ability to roll out these new initiatives and be able to address the gaps? It is highly unlikely that you will have all of the resources and staff capacity to do everything all at once. So we have to think about what factors we're using in prioritization, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. But using that information, we can develop a roadmap. We can start to estimate the value and the outcomes that the organizations can anticipate from different programs that are put into place, and really think about what are our measurable goals from this work, which I know Brett's going to talk about. The personas that you see here relates to evaluating the employee experience, and there are two key components to that. The first being, what is your current employee experience, and how will the new initiatives and plans that are rolled out impact that employee experience, hopefully for the better. So in addition to understanding the value of those programs for the organization as a whole, also thinking about what is the value for individual employees. The other piece of employee experience relates to how employees are going to experience that change. How is it going to be communicated? When is it going to be rolled out? What are the new processes going to be? How are we going to really think about adoption and implementation of those changes and the change management that needs to go along with these new programs? After we have all that, we can put together a strategic plan that really shows what we're going to be working on over the next 3 to 5 years to help improve our workforce, and use that as an ongoing tool to evaluate initiatives and monitor progress. And again, the idea being, we have all of these different goals. How do we scaffold on top of what we've been able to achieve and continue to address those and create some progress? Okay, so the next area that we're going to talk about is prioritization that is scalable. One of the hardest and most important things to do is to prioritize among the various initiatives that your organization may have planned or may have actively in the works to be able to address these workforce challenges. This can be really difficult to do, but it ultimately has the ability to ensure the appropriate resources are dedicated to each initiative, and that, again, efforts can build on each other over time. So the chart here shows a very simplistic way to think about framing these conversations. It's really just meant to be a tool to help you place where each initiative should sit and make sure that we're always focused on doing the high priority, high impact projects, planning the high priority, low impact projects, postponing those low priority, high impact projects, and then eliminating the other projects from our plans because we have way too much in those other 3 boxes. The way that each organization prioritizes is pretty unique based on their individual goals and objectives, but some of the factors that we see driving these conversations include value to your operations, timing, resource needs, and of course, budget. At the end of the day, prioritization should come down to impact and that alignment with your organizational goals and values. But how do you know if you're working on the right things? Well, Brett's going to talk about that next.
Thanks. All right. So again, Tammy, fantastic job. This is a bit of an eye chart, and my goal here isn't to go through the bits and bytes of this, but I just wanted to outline, so how do you know that you're working on the right things? And I think there's a couple things to look at, and whether you want to mirror a dashboard like this or build something else. This is something that we had built for one of our clients. Is we talk about value realization, and so value realization is really the process of managing value throughout and over time, right? And so when I say throughout, it could be throughout an implementation, it could be after a project, or over time, meaning it's really continuous. But I think the key here is when we think about measuring value and understanding what we need to work on and prioritize the things we need to work on, it's about first understanding what the business needs are and some of those business goals, and then aligning what we are doing in our goals back to the business. I get asked all the time from CHROs and others, hey, we've just launched this project, and the CEO or CFO is asking, what value have you brought already, right? And the reality is there's a lot of value that has probably been brought. The problem is it's just not able to be articulated in a business sense or a business way, right? So when I typically go through this exercise, it's really around first is defining the key priorities for the business and HR. It's also about defining what I call HR measures for HR, which those are the things that HR wants to measure for itself. There's probably also things that you want to measure deliberately for the business that ties back to those goals. And then you can also see there's an HR baseline for HR and HR targets for HR, right? So, and then it's really around measuring whether it's monthly, quarterly, this happens to be quarterly, your progress in achieving those things over time. Now, you could have a duplicate of this, and really it says HR baseline for the business, HR targets for the business, and it allows you to then be able to handle something tangible to show the business what HR is doing and why it is important to the business and what results that it's bringing, right? And this is a really key component of being able to manage a lot of these 6 trends, because the business is feeling them too, and they're asking you, what are the programs and processes you're putting in place to mitigate these risks? This is just a simple tool to be able to do that. So before I close, Tammy, I did see a couple comments down here. And then I think then I'll go through questions if you don't mind, and then I will close. One of the questions that I saw was from Roberto Villavazzo, and I know Roberto for years, and Roberto, I think that's more of a statement than a question, so I'm not necessarily going to answer that. But I do agree with you. There is a big component of this that should be reflection on the work that we do, how we measure it, which I think I just talked about, and really being able to look at some of those challenges around productivity. The next 2 questions, Tammy, I'm going to ask that you help answer them with me, and then the third one as well. So Audra and Carol both asked some really great questions about how to manage employee engagement or disengagement. So I'm going to give you my 2 cents, and then I'm going to hand it over to Tammy to let her answer this as well. To me, there's a couple different elements of this. The easy, and I don't want to call it easy because none of this is easy, but one of the most common ways is just engagement surveys, right? So how are your employees responding, and whether that's an annual engagement, biannually, whether you're doing pulse surveys, right? It's just kind of getting a response and a pulse back from the employee population. The challenge with that is that are they just telling you what you want to hear, or are they actually being factual, right? And so there's some psychological safety that needs to be embedded within that culture to make sure people feel comfortable in responding. I think the second way is also around employee performance and productivity. So, if going back to manager and leader development, right? If an employee has been performing at a certain level for years or months or whatever, and automatically dips, right? There's probably a reason for that, or number of employees dip, right? So it could either be viewed as a one-to-one type of scenario, most often it's a one-to-many, but really being able to look at the organizational performance metrics gives you a really good insight into what's happening. I think some of the other things that you might see are around absenteeisms, late, coming to work late, and things like that. But from my perspective, from a business perspective, I think looking at some of those performance productivity and then some of the management observations. So Tammy, what are your thoughts?
I think the most common way that we really see engagement measured is through engagement surveys and potentially even turnover, right? How much turnover do we have in this specific department or function? What is that a percentage of? Do we know why people were leaving? Thinking about maybe even having exit interviews and distilling that information to understand why people might be leaving your organization. One thing that I'll add as a tip for engagement surveys is communicating back to employees to say, hey, this is what we heard from you. And this is what we as a leadership team are going to be doing in order to address the issues and the concerns that you brought up and the ways that we can help increase your engagement. So closing that loop is the first step in really creating that trust and communication about those survey results and how they'll end up being used. So that's the only thing that I would add.
And the last is a request by Pam. And Pam, I wanted to address this because I actually, when I joined Moss Adams, and I'm fairly new, I joined in December. One of the things that most impressed me was our focus on D&I, and it's not just a program. It's about how we live and how we work within the organization. It's something that I'm extremely proud of. I know Tammy, I don't want to speak for you. I'm assuming you are as well. But it is something that's really near and dear to us as a firm and an organization. I actually think that our D&I statement is on our website because we're very proud of the work that we do in that space. But I will see what I can do to find it and send it to you. Yeah, go ahead.
We have a whole web page on our About that goes to inclusion and diversity. And it talks a little bit about our program, and it also has our annual reports for the last 3 years on that page. So you can check it out on our website.
Awesome. Any other questions before I dive into the close? Okay. Well, again, I want to thank you all, but I also want to say that and I mentioned this earlier, that these are 6 trends of many that are going on in the workforce right now, and we'll be holding a series of other webcasts over the next couple months on a number of different topics, and I want to encourage you all to come with some really great questions and engage with us as you have today. But I also want to say that a lot of the challenges that we see today aren't new. They've been around for a long time. And, one of the roles that myself has and that Tammy has is that when we go and engage with clients, our job isn't to just provide them with recommendations to fix the problem. It's our job is to go in and provide recommendations that are actionable and tangible and can ultimately solve their long-term problem. And that's one of my kind of one of my key focus areas is I think about my role is, I want to make sure that we're solving for the long term and not a short-term fix, because again, these are continuous issues. And the question that I ask all the time is, why are they continuous issues? Right. And I know that a lot of things change and a lot of things evolve, but the fact that these are recurring is, it's a little frustrating, right, for everybody. So, but again, thank you very much for your time. Oh, I got a question, Tammy. Look at that. Right at the last minute. Or maybe that was, who was that? Do you see another question?
That was the link to our inclusion and diversity page.
Oh, awesome. Okay, sorry. No more questions then. It was just Sarah, our marketing guru, if you will. But thank you very much for your time. If you have any feedback, please share it. We had great turnout, so thank you for that. Saw some really amazing organizations as part of this. Tammy, any last words from you?
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and feel free to reach out to Brett or myself if you have additional follow-up questions. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Brett and Tammy, for a great presentation today. If we didn't have time to answer your questions, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. Here's a link to our online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining. Well, we hope you'll join us again next time. Thanks so much.